Picture this. You're sitting in church, temple, or mosque, listening to descriptions of heaven and hell, eternal judgment, and the cosmic battle between good and evil. But what if I told you that every single one of these core beliefs that billions hold sacred today didn't originate from the religions you think they did? What if the very foundation of your understanding of the afterlife was actually stolen from a forgotten Persian prophet who lived over 2,500 years ago? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most shocking religious cover-ups. We're talking about how the ancient Persian religion of Zoroastrianism gave birth to virtually every concept of heaven, hell, angels, demons, and final judgment that exists in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This isn't fringe conspiracy, some theory. This is documented historical fact that religious institutions have been downplaying for centuries. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a Persian fire-worshipping prophet named Zoroaster revolutionized human spirituality and changed the course of world religion forever. You'll see the undeniable evidence of how his ideas were absorbed, adapted, and ultimately claimed by the very religions that now dominate our planet. And trust me, once you see this connection, you'll never look at religious teachings the same way again. But before we get into the meat of this story, I need to set the stage for you because this tale involves empires, exile, and one of the most dramatic cultural exchanges in human history. We're going back to a time when the Persian Empire was the superpower of the ancient world, when Jewish people were dragged into Babylonian captivity, and when religious ideas crossed borders like wildfire. The story begins with a man whose name you probably can't even pronounce correctly. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, as he's known in his native tongue, lived somewhere between 628 and 551 BCE in ancient Persia. That's modern-day Iran for those keeping track. This guy wasn't just another religious teacher preaching to a handful of followers. He was the founder of what became the state religion of one of history's most powerful empires. Now here's where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. Every major concept that you associate with the Abrahamic religions was already fully developed in Zoroastrianism centuries before Judaism, Christianity, or Islam even dreamed them up. We're talking about individual judgment after death, heaven and hell, as places of eternal reward and punishment, the resurrection of the body, a final judgment day, and life everlasting for the reunited soul and body. Think about that for a second. All of these ideas that form the absolute bedrock of modern religious thought were being taught by Persian priests while the Jewish people still believed that everyone, good or bad, went to the same dreary underworld called Sheol when they died. There was no heaven, no hell, no eternal punishment or reward. Just a gray, shadowy existence that made the Greek Hades look like a vacation resort. But here's the kicker. These weren't just random religious concepts floating around in isolation. Zoroastrianism presented them as a complete, logical, coherent system. According to Zoroastrian teaching, there's an all-wise, all-good creator god named Ahura Mazda, locked in cosmic battle with an evil destructive spirit called Angra Mainyu. Sound familiar? It should, because this is literally the template for every good versus evil narrative that came after it. In this Persian worldview, humans have free will to choose between good and evil, truth and falsehood. When they die, their souls are judged based on their choices. The righteous cross a bridge to paradise, while the wicked fall into hell. At the end of time, a savior figure called the Sociant will resurrect the dead, judge everyone one final time, and establish a perfect world where good triumphs forever. Now, if you're sitting there thinking this sounds exactly like what you learned in Sunday school, Bible study, or religious education, congratulations. You've just discovered one of the biggest untold stories in human history. The question isn't whether these ideas sound similar. The question is how they made the journey from ancient Persia into the religions that now claim them as their own original revelations. The answer lies in one of the most pivotal moments in Jewish history, an event that would reshape not just Judaism, but eventually Christianity and Islam as well. In 586 BCE, the mighty Babylonian Empire conquered Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and dragged the Jewish elite into exile. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was a complete upheaval of Jewish society, culture, and religious understanding. For nearly 50 years, the educated class of Jewish society lived as captives in Babylon. But then, something remarkable happened. A new empire rose to power, led by a man who would change the course of history. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he was a Zoroastrian. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he didn't just free the Jewish exiles. He actively encouraged them to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. The Hebrew Bible even calls him a Messiah, an anointed one of God. But here's what your religious education probably didn't tell you. Cyrus didn't just free the Jews out of the goodness of his heart. He was implementing a revolutionary policy of religious tolerance that scholars believe was directly inspired by Zoroastrian teachings. Unlike previous empires that imposed their gods and customs on conquered peoples, the Persian Empire under Cyrus allowed different nations to worship their own deities and practice their own religious rites. This created an unprecedented environment for religious ideas to cross cultural boundaries. For the first time in history, you had a massive, multi-ethnic empire where different religious traditions could interact, exchange ideas, and influence each other without fear of persecution or forced conversion. And right at the center of this cultural melting pot were the Jewish exiles, exposed to sophisticated Zoroastrian beliefs for generations. Now, here's where the evidence becomes absolutely undeniable. When you compare Jewish writings from before the Babylonian exile to those written during and after the Persian period, the transformation is shocking. Before contact with Persian religion, Jewish texts show virtually no concept of heaven, hell, angels, demons, or final judgment. After prolonged exposure to Zoroastrian ideas, these concepts suddenly appear throughout Jewish literature. The change is so dramatic that it can't possibly be coincidental. We're not talking about subtle theological evolution here. We're talking about a complete revolutionary transformation of Jewish understanding of the afterlife, divine justice, and cosmic destiny. Ideas that had been central to Zoroastrianism for centuries suddenly became fundamental to Jewish thought. And the evidence isn't just theological, it's linguistic too. One of the Hebrew words for heaven in the Bible is paradise, and this word comes directly from the ancient Iranian phrase Pyri Daeza, meaning enclosed garden. The Persians had actual physical paradise gardens in their palaces, complete with canals, bridges, pathways, and pools. These weren't just decorative landscapes, they were earthly representations of the heavenly realm that awaited the righteous after death. When Cyrus the Great ruled around 550 BCE, he built a palace complex at Pasargadae in Persia that included elaborate gardens representing paradise on earth. These physical paradises served as concrete models for the afterlife imagery that would later permeate Jewish and Christian thought. The word paradise itself, traced back through Old Persian and Avestan, literally means walled enclosure, from pyri meaning around and dis meaning to make or build a wall. Think about the implications of this linguistic borrowing. The Jewish people didn't just absorb abstract theological concepts from the Persians. They adopted the actual Persian word for the heavenly realm and made it central to their religious vocabulary. This is concrete, undeniable evidence of Persian influence on Jewish conceptions of the afterlife. But the borrowing went far beyond vocabulary. The entire structure of cosmic dualism that characterizes later Jewish thought shows clear Zoroastrian influence. The idea of a cosmic battle between forces of good and evil, the concept of a personal devil or Satan figure, the notion of guardian angels assigned to protect individuals, the belief in a coming Savior who will resurrect the dead and establish divine justice on earth. Every single one of these ideas existed in fully developed form in Zoroastrianism before they appeared in Jewish literature. The concept of Satan is particularly revealing. In early Jewish texts, Satan isn't the cosmic enemy of God that Christians know today. He's more like a prosecuting attorney in God's heavenly court, testing human faith but ultimately serving divine purposes. But in Christianity, Satan becomes almost identical to the Zoroastrian concept of Angra Mainyu, a being who chose evil through pride, who roams about corrupting people and polluting the physical world. This isn't just theological similarity, this is direct conceptual inheritance. The parallels between Angra Mainyu and the Christian Satan are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. Both chose evil through pride. Both corrupt humans through temptation. Both have corrupted the physical world. Both will ultimately be defeated in a final cosmic battle between good and evil. The transmission mechanism for these ideas was the Persian administrative system that governed Jewish communities for over 200 years. Even though most Jews probably couldn't read the original Zoroastrian texts called the Gathas, the teachings of Zoroaster were part of the religious culture of the Persian people among whom many Jews lived. The influence came through oral tradition, cultural osmosis, and daily interaction with Persian religious ideas. This cultural exchange wasn't limited to abstract theological concepts. It extended to practical religious ideas that would reshape how people understood their relationship with the divine. The Zoroastrian emphasis on ethical dualism, the constant choice between good and evil, truth and falsehood, may have influenced the Jewish concept of the evil impulse and the good impulse that appears in rabbinic thought during this period. The Persian period represents nothing less than a watershed moment in Jewish theological development. From 538 BCE to 332 BCE, Jewish communities lived under Persian rule, creating centuries of opportunity for religious and philosophical exchange. The Zoroastrian worldview, with its emphasis on cosmic dualism, ethical responsibility, and eschatological judgment, fundamentally reshaped evolving Jewish theological concepts during this crucial period. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the development of Jewish angelology and demonology during this period. Before the Persian exile, Jewish texts contain virtually no mention of named angels or elaborate spiritual hierarchies. But after sustained contact with Zoroastrian beliefs, Jewish literature suddenly explodes with references to archangels, guardian spirits, and complex celestial bureaucracies. This transformation isn't subtle, it's revolutionary. The Zoroastrian system included the Amesha Spentas, divine beings who served Ahura Mazda in the cosmic struggle against evil. These weren't just abstract spiritual forces. They were personified entities with specific names, roles, and characteristics. Sound familiar? It should, because this is exactly the template that Jewish angelology would follow. The Zoroastrian concept of the Fravashi, a divine guardian spirit assigned to protect each individual human being, provides the direct inspiration for the Jewish and Christian idea of guardian angels. This wasn't a vague spiritual concept. In Zoroastrian belief, every person had a specific protective spirit watching over them, guiding their choices between good and evil, and advocating for them in the spiritual realm. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. The transmission of these ideas didn't stop with Judaism. When Christianity emerged from its Jewish roots, it inherited all of these Persian-influenced concepts and amplified them even further. The Christian understanding of Satan, demons, angels, heaven, hell, and final judgment represents a two-stage borrowing process. First, from Zoroastrianism into Zoroastrianism, then from Judaism into Christianity. Early Christian writers, like the authors of the New Testament, didn't realize they were propagating ideas that originated in ancient Persia. They thought they were preserving and expanding upon authentic Jewish revelation. But in reality, they were passing along theological concepts that had already traveled thousands of miles and crossed multiple cultural boundaries before reaching them. The concept of individual judgment after death provides a perfect example of this transmission process. In original Zoroastrian teaching, the soul departs the body 4 days after death and must cross the Chinvat Bridge, also known as the Bridge of Judgment. Good souls are greeted by a beautiful maiden who guides them into paradise, while evil souls are seized by a terrifying hag and dragged down into hell. This imagery of crossing over to judgment appears throughout later Jewish and Christian eschatology, but it's presented as original revelation rather than borrowed Persian mythology. The Bridge of Judgment, the personified guides who meet souls after death, the immediate sorting of righteous and wicked, all of these elements existed in fully developed form in Zoroastrianism centuries before they appeared in Jewish or Christian texts. The development of messianic expectations shows equally clear Persian influence. The Zoroastrian figure of the Saoshyant was a future savior who would appear at the end of time to resurrect the dead, judge the world, and establish divine justice on earth. This wasn't just a vague hope for better times. It was a detailed prophetic framework that included specific events, cosmic battles, and ultimate transformation of reality. When Jewish messianic hopes began developing during the Persian period, they followed this exact template. The coming Messiah would defeat evil, resurrect the dead, judge all humanity, and establish God's kingdom on earth. The parallels aren't just thematic, they're structural, following the same sequence of events and achieving the same ultimate goals. Christianity took these Jewish messianic expectations, claimed they were fulfilled in Jesus, and projected them forward to a second coming that would complete the process. But the entire framework, the Savior figure, the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the establishment of divine rule, all of it traces back to Persian religious imagination. The resistance to acknowledging this influence often comes from theological rather than historical considerations. Religious institutions have powerful reasons to minimize discussion of foreign borrowing. If your faith claims to be based on unique divine revelation, admitting that core doctrines were borrowed from other religions creates obvious problems for claims of exclusive truth. But the historical evidence is overwhelming. Most scholars, including Jewish scholars, acknowledge that Judaism was strongly influenced by Zoroastrianism in views relating to angelology, demonology, resurrection, and eschatological ideas in general. This represents broad academic consensus across religious and cultural boundaries about the reality of Persian influence. The chronological evidence makes the direction of influence absolutely clear. Zoroastrian teachings were generally established throughout Iran before the time of Jewish captivity. The Persian prophet Zoroaster lived and taught his revolutionary ideas about cosmic dualism, individual judgment, and eternal reward and punishment centuries before Jewish exposure to these concepts during the exile period. This isn't speculation or theoretical reconstruction. Archaeological evidence from Persian palace complexes shows physical paradise, gardens dating Gris the Great's reign around to Sid, 550 BCE. Zoroastrian texts preserve detailed descriptions of afterlife beliefs that predate Jewish adoption of similar ideas by centuries. The linguistic evidence shows Persian loanwords entering Hebrew vocabulary during the exile period. What we're looking at isn't gradual theological evolution or independent parallel development. We're seeing direct cultural transmission of religious ideas from a dominant imperial culture to subject populations living under Persian rule. The mechanism was systematic exposure over multiple generations, creating perfect conditions for Persian religious concepts to permeate Jewish thought. The Persian administrative approach facilitated this unprecedented religious exchange. Unlike customs through previous empires that imposed their gods and force, the Achaemenid Persians practiced tolerance and respect for local traditions. They allowed conquered peoples to continue worshiping their own deities while simultaneously exposing them to Persian religious culture through daily interaction and administrative contact. This created a unique environment where religious ideas could flow freely between cultures without forced conversion or violent suppression. Jewish communities maintained their distinct identity while absorbing Persian theological innovations that enhanced and expanded their understanding of divine justice, cosmic purpose, and individual destiny. The transformation of Jewish understanding of Sheol provides perhaps the clearest example of this process. In pre-exilic Jewish thought, Sheol was a dreary underworld where all souls, the righteous and wicked alike, experience same colorless existence. There was no moral differentiation, no rewards for virtue, no punishment for evil. Death was simply the end of meaningful existence. But during the Persian period, Jewish understanding of the afterlife underwent complete transformation. Sheol became differentiated. The souls of the righteous departed to places of blessing, while the wicked faced places of torment. This wasn't gradual evolution. It was revolutionary change that aligned perfectly with Persian beliefs about moral consequences extending beyond death. The New Testament writers inherited this Persian-influenced Jewish framework and developed it further. Hell became a place of eternal fire and punishment, while heaven offered eternal reward for the faithful. The imagery became more vivid, the consequences more dramatic, but the underlying structure remained the same. Individual judgment leading to eternal reward or punishment based on moral choices made during life. Contemporary scholarship increasingly recognizes the extent of Zoroastrian influence on later world religions. The theological concepts that define Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, dualism, eschatology, ethical monotheism, angelology, demonology, and individual judgment, all show clear Persian origins. Heaven and hell, final judgment, messianic expectation, cosmic battle between good and evil, these aren't independent revelations received by different prophets in different cultures. They're variations on themes first articulated by a Persian fire priest 25 centuries ago, transmitted through cultural contact, adapted to local conditions, and ultimately claimed as original divine revelation by religions that now dominate global spirituality. The evidence isn't circumstantial or speculative. It's documented, systematic, and overwhelming. The implications of this historical reality extend far beyond academic interest in ancient religious development. If the core beliefs that define modern religious understanding were borrowed from a Persian source that preceded them by centuries, what does that mean for claims of unique divine revelation? What does it mean for religious authority based on exclusive access to divine truth? These aren't just historical questions. They're fundamental challenges to religious worldviews that billions of people hold sacred today. The story of how Persian religious ideas conquered the world through cultural transmission rather than military force represents one of the most significant and under-acknowledged developments in human spiritual history. And here's where this story takes an even more shocking turn, because we're about to see how these Persian ideas didn't just influence Judaism and Christianity. They went on to completely reshape Islam as well, creating a triple borrowing that spans over 1,000 years of religious development. When Muhammad began receiving his revelations in 7th century Arabia, he was building on Jewish and Christian traditions that had already been fundamentally altered by Persian influence. The Islamic concepts of paradise, hell, final judgment, and cosmic battle between good and evil weren't direct borrowings from Zoroastrianism. They were inherited through Jewish and Christian intermediaries who had already absorbed and adapted Persian ideas centuries earlier. Think about the implications of this transmission chain. Persian religious concepts traveled from ancient Iran through Jewish communities during the Babylonian exile, got incorporated into Jewish theology, passed into early Christianity through Jewish converts, and finally reached Islamic teaching through both Jewish and Christian sources that Muhammad encountered in Arabia. It's like a massive game of theological telephone that lasted over a millennium. The Islamic description of paradise shows particularly striking parallels to Persian garden imagery. The Quran describes paradise as gardens beneath which rivers flow, with pavilions, fountains, and eternal springs. This isn't just poetic language. It's a direct echo of those physical Persian paradise gardens that Cyrus the Great built at Pasargadae over 1,000 years earlier. But here's what makes this even more incredible. The Persian Empire had created trading routes and cultural connections that spread their religious ideas far beyond their political boundaries. Persian merchants, administrators, and cultural influences reached into Arabia, India, Central Asia, and even China. Wherever Persian culture established itself, these afterlife concepts followed. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route for goods. It was a superhighway for religious ideas. Persian concepts of cosmic dualism, individual judgment, and eternal consequences spread along these trade networks, influencing Buddhist concepts of karma and rebirth, Hindu ideas about divine justice, and even Chinese philosophical traditions about cosmic balance. Now, you might be wondering why this massive influence has been so thoroughly hidden from public knowledge. The answer is both simple and disturbing. Religious institutions have spent centuries minimizing acknowledgement of foreign borrowing because it undermines their claims to unique divine revelation. If your religion teaches that its core beliefs came directly from God through exclusive prophetic revelation, admitting that those same beliefs existed in other cultures centuries earlier creates obvious theological problems. How can you claim divine uniqueness when the historical record shows clear cultural borrowing? The solution has been to downplay, ignore, or actively suppress discussion of Persian influence. Seminary students learn about Jewish history, Christian development, and Islamic origins, but they rarely get detailed information about Zoroastrian precedents for their core beliefs. The evidence is relegated to academic journals and specialized scholarship that most believers never encounter. This isn't accidental ignorance. It's systematic information management designed to preserve religious authority. When ordinary believers discover that their most sacred concepts originated in Persian fire temples rather than divine revelation, it raises uncomfortable questions about religious truth claims. But the historical evidence keeps mounting, and it's becoming impossible to ignore. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal Persian religious artifacts that predate Jewish, Christian, and Islamic versions of the same concepts. Linguistic analysis shows more Persian loanwords entering Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic religious vocabulary. Comparative religious studies demonstrate systematic parallels that can't be explained by coincidence. The Persian prophet Zoroaster didn't just create another ancient religion that faded into obscurity. He revolutionized human understanding of cosmic justice, individual responsibility, and eternal consequences in ways that continue to shape billions of lives today. His ideas about the struggle between good and evil, the importance of personal moral choices, and the ultimate triumph of divine justice became the foundation for how most of humanity understands spiritual reality. Every time you hear about heaven and hell in a sermon, every time you read about final judgment in religious texts, every time you encounter discussions of angels and demons in popular culture, you're experiencing the long-term influence of Persian religious imagination. The concepts that define modern spirituality for most of the world's population originated not in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, or Mecca, but in ancient Iran over 25 centuries ago. The Persian influence even extends to religious practices and institutions that seem completely disconnected from ancient Iran. The Christian emphasis on confession and absolution shows parallels to Zoroastrian concepts of purification from sin. The Islamic practice of ritual prayer, facing a specific direction, echoes Persian traditions of fire worship oriented toward sacred flames. Jewish concepts of ritual purity and spiritual cleansing reflect Persian concerns about contamination from evil influences. These aren't superficial similarities. They represent deep structural parallels that suggest systematic cultural transmission rather than independent development. When you map out the historical timeline, geographical spread, and conceptual development, the evidence points consistently toward Persian origins for ideas that billions now consider fundamental religious truth. The Persian administrative genius lay not just in military conquest or political organization, but in creating conditions for cultural synthesis that allowed their religious innovations to spread far beyond their empire's boundaries. By practicing tolerance rather than forced conversion, they enabled their ideas to take root in other cultures through voluntary adoption rather than imperial coercion. This approach proved far more effective for long-term influence than military force could ever achieve. Persian armies eventually fell to Alexander the Great, and the Achaemenid Empire collapsed in the 4th century BCE. But Persian religious ideas had already embedded themselves so deeply in Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic thought that they survived the empire's political destruction and continued spreading for centuries afterward. The Zoroastrian community itself gradually diminished over time, persecuted by Islamic conquests and reduced to small populations in Iran and India. Today, fewer than 200,000 Zoroastrians remain worldwide, but their prophets' ideas about cosmic justice, individual judgment, and eternal consequences now influence nearly 4 billion people through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's one of history's greatest ironies. The religion that gave birth to the afterlife concepts that define modern spirituality has almost disappeared, while the traditions that borrowed those concepts have become the dominant world religions. Zoroastrianism created the theological framework that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam built upon, but it receives virtually no credit for this foundational contribution. The Persian influence on Western civilization extends beyond religion into philosophy, ethics, and political theory. The Zoroastrian emphasis on individual moral responsibility influenced Greek philosophical traditions about personal virtue and cosmic justice. Persian concepts of universal human dignity under divine law contributed to later developments in legal theory and human rights. The American founding fathers drew on Enlightenment philosophers who had been influenced by Persian ideas filtered through centuries of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic development. Concepts of religious tolerance, individual rights, and cosmic justice that seem distinctly Western actually trace back to Persian innovations in religious and political thought. Even modern scientific thinking shows traces of Persian influence. The Zoroastrian understanding of cosmic conflict between order and chaos, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, provided conceptual frameworks that influenced later scientific approaches to understanding natural phenomena. The idea that natural processes involve systematic struggles between opposing forces reflects ancient Persian insights about cosmic dualism. The Persian legacy in art and literature is equally profound. The paradise imagery that appears throughout Western poetry, painting, and architecture derives from those original Persian garden designs. Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, and countless other literary masterworks build on Persian conceptions of afterlife geography and moral consequences. Popular culture continues to draw on Persian religious innovations without acknowledging their source. Every movie about cosmic battles between good and evil, every novel about individual souls facing eternal judgment, every video game featuring heavenly rewards and hellish punishments reflects the long-term influence of Zoroastrian imagination on human storytelling. The Persian contribution to human civilization represents one of history's most successful cultural exports. Ideas developed in ancient Iran over 2 millennia ago continue shaping how billions of people understand existence, meaning, purpose, and destiny. The concepts that define modern religious experience originated not through divine revelation to Hebrew prophets or Christian apostles or Islamic messengers, but through the innovative thinking of a Persian fire priest whose name most people can't even pronounce. This doesn't diminish the value or importance of these concepts. Ideas about individual moral responsibility, cosmic justice, and eternal consequences have provided meaning and guidance for countless generations. They've inspired magnificent art, literature, and music. They've motivated social reform movements and individual acts of heroism. They've offered comfort in times of grief and hope in periods of despair. But understanding their true historical origins changes how we think about religious authority, cultural borrowing, and the development of human spiritual understanding. It reveals that the most profound religious insights often emerge through cultural exchange rather than isolated revelation. It shows that spiritual truth transcends the boundaries of any single tradition or community. The Persian gift to world religion wasn't just a collection of theological concepts. It was a revolutionary approach to understanding human existence that emphasized individual choice, moral consequence, and ultimate justice. These ideas proved so compelling that they conquered the world not through military force, but through their power to address fundamental human concerns about meaning, purpose, and destiny. The story of how Persian religious ideas reshaped world spirituality reveals something profound about human nature and cultural development. When people encounter ideas that better explain their experience of moral struggle, cosmic purpose, and individual significance, they adopt those ideas regardless of their cultural source. The Persian concepts spread because they worked better than previous approaches to understanding spiritual reality. The historical evidence shows that religious development often involves creative borrowing, adaptation, and synthesis, rather than purely original revelation. The traditions that became Judaism, Christianity, and Islam didn't emerge in cultural isolation. They developed through complex interactions with surrounding civilizations, absorbing useful ideas while maintaining their distinctive identities. This process of cultural exchange and religious synthesis continues today, as global communication creates unprecedented opportunities for spiritual traditions to encounter and influence each other. The Persian precedent suggests that the most successful religious innovations will be those that address universal human concerns, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to different cultural contexts. The Persian legacy reminds us that spiritual insight often emerges through historical processes of cultural interaction rather than supernatural intervention. The ideas that now define religious experience for billions originated through human creativity, cultural exchange, and historical development, rather than divine dictation to isolated prophets. Understanding this historical reality doesn't require abandoning religious faith or spiritual practice, but it does suggest approaching religious truth claims with greater humility and appreciation for the complex cultural processes through which spiritual traditions develop and spread. The Persian contribution to world religion represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. A single prophet's insights about cosmic justice, individual responsibility, and eternal consequences proved so compelling that they reshaped human spiritual understanding across multiple civilizations and continue influencing billions of lives today. The story of Persian religious influence doesn't end with the spread of core afterlife concepts. We're about to dive into something that will absolutely blow your mind about how deeply these ideas penetrated into every aspect of religious thinking you take for granted today. Let's talk about the concept of religious warfare between light and darkness. Every single epic battle between good and evil that you've ever encountered in religious texts, movies, or literature traces back to the Zoroastrian cosmic war between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. This wasn't just abstract theology. The Persians developed detailed mythologies about how cosmic forces of light and darkness wage eternal battle for control of the universe. In Zoroastrian teaching, this cosmic conflict plays out on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the universal battle between divine forces, the personal struggle within each human soul, and the historical progression toward ultimate victory of good over evil. Sound familiar? It should, because this exact framework appears in Jewish concepts of the war between God and Satan, Christian ideas about spiritual warfare, and Islamic teachings about the struggle between truth and falsehood. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about this transmission. The Persians didn't just create abstract concepts about cosmic dualism. They developed practical techniques for participating in this spiritual warfare. Zoroastrian priests performed daily rituals to strengthen the forces of light and weaken the powers of darkness. They taught specific prayers, practiced purification ceremonies, and maintained sacred fires that represented the eternal struggle against evil. These practical approaches to spiritual warfare found their way into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions through the same cultural transmission processes we've been discussing. Jewish concepts of ritual purity, Christian practices of prayer and fasting, Islamic emphasis on spiritual discipline. All of these show clear Persian influence in their approach to combating spiritual darkness through disciplined religious practice. The Persian impact on religious calendar systems represents another shocking example of cultural borrowing that most people never recognize. Zoroastrian festivals celebrating the triumph of light over darkness, the renewal of cosmic order, and the resurrection of natural life provided templates for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic holy days that billions observe today. The Persian New Year celebration, called Nowruz, included specific rituals for spiritual purification, renewal of cosmic order, and preparation for divine judgment. These ceremonial elements appear throughout later Jewish festivals, like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Christian celebrations of Easter and Christmas, and Islamic observances of Ramadan and Eid. The timing isn't coincidental. Persian festivals were carefully coordinated with astronomical events that symbolized cosmic renewal and spiritual transformation. When Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions developed their own festival calendars, they adopted similar timing patterns that reflected Persian understanding of cosmic cycles and spiritual significance. But the Persian influence on religious architecture and sacred spaces might be the most visually stunning example of cultural transmission that's hiding in plain sight. Those soaring cathedral spires reaching toward heaven, those elaborate mosque domes representing cosmic perfection, those synagogue designs emphasizing the connection between earthly and heavenly realms. They all trace back to Persian innovations in sacred architecture. Persian fire temples weren't just functional buildings for religious ceremonies. They were carefully designed representations of cosmic order that physically embodied theological concepts about the relationship between earthly and heavenly realms. the vertical emphasis that draws the eye upward, the use of light and shadow to create spiritual atmosphere, the geometric patterns that suggest infinite divine perfection. These architectural elements became standard features in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sacred spaces. The Persian genius lay in understanding that physical environments could enhance spiritual experience and reinforce theological teaching. When worshippers entered a properly designed sacred space, the architecture itself communicated religious concepts about divine transcendence, cosmic order, and human spiritual aspiration. This architectural influence spread along the same routes as Persian theological concepts. Jewish synagogues built during the Persian period show clear Persian design influences. Early Christian churches incorporated Persian architectural elements that enhanced the spiritual impact of religious ceremonies. Islamic mosque design drew heavily on Persian innovations in creating sacred spaces that facilitated spiritual experience. The Persian contribution to religious music and liturgical arts represents another hidden influence that shaped how billions experience spiritual practice today. Zoroastrian ceremonial music used specific scales, rhythms, and vocal techniques designed to induce altered states of consciousness that enhanced religious experience and spiritual insight. These musical innovations found their way into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic liturgical traditions through the same cultural transmission processes that spread Persian theological concepts. The haunting melodies of Jewish prayers, the soaring harmonies of Christian hymns, the rhythmic chanting of Islamic devotions. They all show traces of Persian innovations in religious music designed to enhance spiritual experience. The Persian understanding of religious symbolism created visual languages that continue shaping religious art and imagery today. The Persian use of fire as a symbol of divine presence, light as representation of spiritual truth, and geometric patterns as expressions of cosmic order provided templates that appear throughout later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religious art. Persian innovations in religious storytelling and mythological narrative had equally profound influence on later religious traditions. The Persian approach to religious narrative emphasized moral instruction through compelling stories about cosmic conflict, individual choice, and ultimate justice. These storytelling techniques appear throughout Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religious literature. The Persian contribution to religious law and ethical systems represents another massive influence that most people never recognize. Zoroastrian legal traditions emphasized individual responsibility, moral consequences, and divine justice in ways that profoundly influenced later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic approaches to religious law and ethical teaching. Persian legal innovations included concepts of universal human dignity, protection for the vulnerable, and cosmic consequences for moral choices that became fundamental principles in later religious legal systems. The Persian emphasis on truthfulness, justice, and compassion provided ethical frameworks that appear throughout Jewish, Christian, and Islamic moral teaching. But here's where this story takes an absolutely shocking turn that reveals the true scope of Persian influence on world religion. We're about to discover how Persian ideas didn't just influence the major monotheistic traditions. They reshaped religious thinking across multiple continents and cultural systems. Persian merchants and administrators carried their religious concepts along trade routes that extended from China to North Africa. Wherever Persian cultural influence established itself, these theological innovations took root and began influencing local religious traditions. The Silk Road became a superhighway for Persian religious concepts that transformed spiritual understanding across vast geographic regions. Persian influence on Buddhist concepts of cosmic justice and individual karma represents one of the most fascinating examples of cross-cultural religious transmission. Buddhist ideas about moral consequences extending beyond individual lifetimes show clear Persian influence in their emphasis on cosmic justice and individual responsibility for spiritual development. The Persian concept of individual souls facing judgment based on moral choices appears in Buddhist teachings about karmic consequences and spiritual advancement through multiple lifetimes. The Persian emphasis on personal responsibility for spiritual development influenced Buddhist approaches to meditation, ethical discipline, and liberation from suffering. Persian influence on Hindu concepts of cosmic cycles and divine justice represents another stunning example of cultural transmission across religious boundaries. Hindu ideas about cosmic ages, divine incarnations, and ultimate spiritual liberation show Persian influence in their emphasis on cosmic conflict between good and evil forces. The Persian understanding of cosmic dualism influenced Hindu concepts of divine forces maintaining cosmic balance through eternal struggle between constructive and destructive principles. Persian emphasis on individual moral choices affecting cosmic destiny appears throughout Hindu teachings about dharma, karma, and spiritual liberation. Even Chinese philosophical traditions show traces of Persian influence transmitted through cultural contact along trade routes. Chinese concepts of cosmic balance between opposing forces, individual responsibility for maintaining harmony, and ultimate justice governing natural and social order reflect Persian innovations in understanding cosmic principles. The Persian contribution to African religious traditions through trade contact and cultural exchange represents another hidden influence that shaped spiritual understanding across multiple cultures. Persian concepts of individual judgment, cosmic justice, and divine protection influenced African religious traditions that emphasized ancestor veneration, spiritual warfare, and cosmic harmony. Persian influence on European pagan traditions through cultural contact and trade represents yet another example of how these theological innovations spread far beyond their original cultural boundaries. European concepts of individual souls facing judgment after death, cosmic battles between light and darkness, and ultimate triumph of divine justice all show traces of Persian religious influence. The Persian impact on Native American spiritual traditions through trans-Pacific cultural contact represents one of the most surprising examples of how far these religious concepts traveled. Native American traditions that emphasize individual spiritual responsibility, cosmic balance between opposing forces, and ultimate justice governing natural and social order show potential Persian influence through complex cultural transmission processes. The scope of Persian religious influence represents nothing less than a complete transformation of human spiritual understanding that affected virtually every major religious tradition on earth. The theological innovations developed by a single Persian prophet 25 centuries ago reshaped how humanity understands cosmic purpose, individual responsibility, and ultimate destiny. This massive cultural influence happened without military conquest, forced conversion, or imperial coercion. Persian religious concepts spread because they addressed fundamental human concerns about meaning, justice, and spiritual purpose more effectively than previous approaches to religious understanding. The Persian approach to religious tolerance created conditions that allowed their theological innovations to take root in diverse cultural contexts without of history's most destroying local traditions. This represents one successful example of cultural influence achieved through persuasion rather than force. The Persian legacy in world religion reveals something profound about human nature and spiritual development. When people encounter religious ideas that better explain their experience of moral struggle, cosmic purpose, and individual significance, they adopt those concepts regardless of cultural boundaries or traditional loyalties. The Persian contribution to human civilization extends far beyond religious concepts into fundamental approaches to understanding existence, meaning, and purpose. The Persian emphasis on individual choice, Moral responsibility and cosmic justice became foundational principles that continue shaping human thought across multiple disciplines and cultural contexts. Persian innovations in religious thinking provided conceptual frameworks that influenced philosophy, ethics, political theory, scientific understanding, artistic expression, and literary creation. The Persian legacy appears in virtually every aspect of human cultural development that involves questions about meaning, purpose, and ultimate reality. The Persian influence on legal systems and political theory represents another massive contribution that most people never recognize. Persian concepts of universal human dignity, divine authority limiting political power, and cosmic justice governing earthly affairs influenced legal and political developments across multiple civilizations. Persian innovations in educational approaches and intellectual development provided templates for religious education that appear throughout Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. The Persian emphasis on individual spiritual development through disciplined study and practice influenced educational approaches that continue shaping religious instruction today. The Persian contribution to medical understanding and healing practices represents another hidden influence that shaped approaches to physical and spiritual health. Persian concepts of cosmic balance affecting individual well-being, spiritual discipline enhancing physical health, and divine intervention in healing processes influenced medical traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in agricultural practices and environmental stewardship reflected religious concepts about cosmic harmony and individual responsibility that influenced approaches to natural resource management across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of human responsibility for maintaining cosmic balance appears in agricultural and environmental practices that continue shaping approaches to sustainability and stewardship. The Persian legacy in trade practices and economic systems reflects religious concepts about individual responsibility, cosmic justice, and divine blessing that influenced commercial development across vast geographic regions. Persian approaches to trade that emphasized fairness, honesty, and mutual benefit created economic frameworks that appear throughout cultures influenced by Persian religious concepts. Persian contributions to military strategy and diplomatic practice reflected religious concepts about cosmic conflict and ultimate justice that influenced approaches to warfare and international relations. The Persian emphasis on religious tolerance and cultural respect created diplomatic approaches that proved more effective than pure military force for achieving long-term political objectives. The Persian influence on family structure and social organization represents another profound contribution that shaped human societies across multiple cultures. Persian religious concepts about individual responsibility, cosmic justice, and divine protection influenced family practices and social structures that appear throughout cultures that encountered Persian religious ideas. Persian innovations in artistic expression and cultural production provided templates that continue influencing creative work today. The Persian understanding of art as a spiritual practice that connects earthly and heavenly realms appears throughout artistic traditions that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to linguistic development through religious vocabulary and conceptual frameworks represents another massive influence that shaped human communication about spiritual and philosophical concepts. Persian religious terminology entered dozens of languages and provided conceptual tools that continue shaping religious and philosophical discourse. Persian influence on mathematical and astronomical understanding reflects religious concepts about cosmic order and divine perfection that influenced scientific development across multiple civilizations. The Persian understanding of mathematical principles as expressions of divine order appears in scientific traditions that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in technological development reflects religious concepts about human responsibility for improving earthly conditions that influenced innovation and invention across diverse cultural contexts. Persian approaches to technology that emphasized cosmic harmony and individual responsibility appear throughout cultures that encountered Persian religious ideas. Persian contributions to psychological understanding and spiritual development provided frameworks for understanding human nature and spiritual growth that continue influencing religious and therapeutic practices today. The Persian emphasis on individual choice and moral development influenced psychological approaches that appear throughout traditions showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian impact on gender relations and social equality reflects religious concepts about universal human dignity and divine justice that influenced social development across multiple cultures. Persian religious ideas about individual spiritual worth, regardless of social status, appear throughout cultures that encountered Persian influence. Persian innovations in child-rearing and educational practices reflected religious concepts about individual spiritual development and cosmic responsibility that influenced family and educational approaches across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of education as spiritual formation appears throughout educational traditions that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to aging and death practices reflects religious concepts about individual judgment and eternal consequences that influenced approaches to mortality and afterlife preparation across multiple cultures. Persian religious ideas about death as spiritual transition appear throughout funeral and mourning practices that show Persian influence. Persian innovations in community organization and social cooperation reflected religious concepts about cosmic harmony and individual responsibility that influenced social structures across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of community as spiritual practice appears throughout social organizations that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in conflict resolution and peacemaking reflects religious concepts about cosmic justice and ultimate harmony that influenced diplomatic and legal approaches across multiple civilizations. Persian religious ideas about truth and reconciliation appear throughout peacemaking traditions that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on environmental relationships and natural resource management reflects religious concepts about cosmic balance and human responsibility that influenced ecological approaches across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of nature as divine creation requiring careful stewardship appears throughout environmental practices that show Persian influence. The Persian contribution to seasonal celebrations and cyclical observances reflects religious concepts about cosmic renewal and spiritual transformation that influenced festival traditions across multiple cultures. Persian religious ideas about time as spiritual opportunity appear throughout ceremonial practices that show Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in hospitality and social interaction reflected religious concepts about universal human dignity and divine blessing that influenced social customs across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of hospitality as religious duty appears throughout social practices that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy continues influencing contemporary religious development, as global communication creates new opportunities for spiritual traditions to encounter and learn from each other. The Persian precedent suggests that successful religious innovation often involves creative synthesis of diverse spiritual insights rather than isolated revelation. The Persian contribution to human spiritual understanding represents one of the greatest intellectual achievements in history. A single prophet's insights about cosmic justice, individual responsibility, and ultimate purpose proved so compelling that they reshaped religious thinking across multiple continents and continue influencing billions of lives today. But the story doesn't end with historical influence. The Persian legacy raises profound questions about religious authority, cultural borrowing, and the nature of spiritual truth that continue challenging contemporary religious understanding. If the concepts that define modern religious experience originated through cultural transmission rather than divine revelation, what does that mean for claims about exclusive religious truth? These questions become even more urgent as archaeological evidence continues revealing the extent of Persian influence on religions that claim unique divine authority. Recent discoveries show Persian religious artifacts predating Jewish, Christian, and Islamic versions of the same concepts by centuries, making the direction of cultural influence absolutely undeniable. The Persian Revolution in religious thinking created conceptual frameworks that transcend any single tradition or community. The ideas about individual moral responsibility, cosmic justice, and ultimate purpose that originated in ancient Iran continue providing meaning and guidance for people across diverse cultural and religious backgrounds. Understanding the true historical origins of these concepts doesn't diminish their value or importance, but it does suggest approaching religious truth claims with greater humility and appreciation for the complex cultural processes through which spiritual traditions develop and influence each other. The Persian gift to humanity wasn't just a collection of theological concepts. It was a revolutionary approach to understanding existence that emphasized individual choice, moral consequence, and ultimate meaning in ways that continue shaping human spiritual experience today. The Persian prophet Zoroaster didn't just create another ancient religion that faded into historical obscurity. He revolutionized human understanding of cosmic purpose and individual significance in ways that conquered the world through the power of ideas rather than military force. This represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human intellectual history. The religious concepts developed in ancient Persia over 25 centuries ago continue defining spiritual experience for the majority of humanity today, even though most people have no idea where these ideas actually originated. The Persian legacy reveals that the most profound spiritual insights often emerge through cultural exchange and historical development rather than supernatural intervention. The concepts that now define religious experience for billions developed through human creativity, cultural interaction, and historical processes rather than divine dictation to isolated prophets. This understanding doesn't require abandoning religious faith or spiritual practice, but it does suggest approaching religious development with greater appreciation for the complex cultural dynamics through which spiritual traditions emerge, spread, and influence each other across historical time and geographic space. The Persian contribution to world religion represents a testament to human intellectual creativity and spiritual insight that transcends the boundaries of any single culture or tradition. The ideas that originated in ancient Iran continue providing frameworks for understanding existence, meaning, and purpose that speak to universal human concerns about individual significance and cosmic justice. The Persian mastery of religious psychology represents perhaps their most sophisticated contribution to human spiritual development. Zoroastrian priests didn't just teach abstract concepts about cosmic dualism. They developed detailed techniques for helping individuals experience direct personal encounters with spiritual forces that shaped their understanding of reality itself. These psychological innovations included specific meditation practices designed to heighten awareness of the cosmic battle between good and evil within individual consciousness. Persian religious teachers understood that intellectual knowledge about spiritual warfare meant nothing unless people could actually experience these forces operating in their own lives. They created practical exercises that made abstract theological concepts into lived personal experiences. The Persian approach to spiritual psychology influenced every major religious tradition that encountered it. Jewish mystical practices like those found in Kabbalah show clear Persian influence in their emphasis on direct spiritual experience and cosmic awareness. Christian contemplative traditions developed meditation techniques that mirror Persian methods for achieving heightened spiritual consciousness. Islamic Sufi practices preserve Persian innovations in using physical movement, breathing exercises, and rhythmic chanting to induce altered states of spiritual awareness. But here's what makes this psychological influence absolutely revolutionary. The Persians understood that religious transformation required more than just believing correct doctrines or following proper rituals. They developed systematic approaches to personality change that helped people actually become different kinds of human beings through spiritual practice. This emphasis on personal transformation through disciplined spiritual work appears throughout later religious traditions, but most people don't realize they're experiencing Persian innovations in spiritual psychology. When Christians talk about being born again, when Jews discuss teshuvah or spiritual return, when Muslims emphasize the greater jihad of internal spiritual struggle, they're drawing on psychological frameworks that originated in ancient Persian religious practice. The Persian contribution to understanding human motivation and behavior change represents one of their most practical legacies. Zoroastrian teachers recognize that most people struggle with internal conflicts between good and evil impulses, and they developed specific techniques for strengthening moral motivation while weakening destructive tendencies. These Persian insights about human psychology influenced philosophical and therapeutic approaches that extend far beyond religious contexts. The Persian understanding that people can change fundamental aspects of their personality through disciplined practice provided conceptual foundations that appear throughout later developments in philosophy, psychology, and personal development. Persian innovations in group dynamics and community building reflected their sophisticated understanding of how spiritual transformation occurs through social interaction rather than isolated individual practice. Zoroastrian communities developed specific approaches to mutual support, accountability, and encouragement that enhanced individual spiritual development through group participation. These community-building techniques appear throughout later religious traditions that show Persian influence. Jewish concepts of community responsibility for individual spiritual welfare, Christian emphasis on fellowship and mutual accountability, Islamic approaches to ummah, or community solidarity, all reflect Persian innovations in using social dynamics to enhance individual spiritual development. The Persian understanding of leadership and spiritual authority created models that continue shaping religious institutions today. Zoroastrian approaches to religious leadership emphasized moral character, spiritual wisdom, and practical effectiveness rather than hereditary status or political power. These leadership principles appear throughout religious traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in handling religious diversity and theological disagreement provided frameworks for managing conflicts that arise when different spiritual traditions encounter each other. The Persian policy of religious tolerance wasn't just political pragmatism. It reflected sophisticated theological understanding about how divine truth might manifest through diverse cultural expressions. This Persian approach to religious diversity influenced later developments in interfaith relations and theological pluralism. Jewish concepts of righteous Gentiles, Christian ideas about anonymous Christians, Islamic teachings about people of the book, all show traces of Persian innovations in understanding how divine truth might operate through diverse religious traditions. The Persian contribution to understanding spiritual stages and developmental processes represents another crucial legacy that shaped approaches to religious education and personal growth. Zoroastrian teachers recognize that spiritual development occurs through predictable stages that require different types of instruction and support at different levels of advancement. These Persian insights about spiritual development influenced educational approaches throughout later religious traditions. Jewish concepts of different levels of Torah study, Christian ideas about stages of spiritual maturity, Islamic approaches to different levels of spiritual realization all reflect Persian innovations in understanding how spiritual growth actually occurs in human experience. Persian innovations in ritual design and ceremonial practice reflected sophisticated understanding of how symbolic activities can enhance spiritual experience and reinforce religious teaching. Zoroastrian rituals weren't just traditional customs passed down through generations. They were carefully crafted psychological tools designed to produce specific spiritual effects in participants. This Persian approach to ritual effectiveness influenced ceremonial developments throughout later religious traditions. Jewish ritual innovations during the Persian period, early Christian liturgical developments, Islamic ceremonial practices all show Persian influence in their sophisticated understanding of how symbolic activities can enhance spiritual experience. The Persian contribution to religious art and symbolic expression provided visual languages that continue shaping spiritual communication today. Persian religious artists understood that visual symbols could communicate spiritual truths that transcended verbal explanation, and they developed artistic techniques specifically designed to enhance religious understanding and spiritual experience. These Persian innovations in religious art influenced artistic developments throughout cultures that encountered Persian aesthetic approaches. Byzantine religious art, Islamic geometric patterns, Jewish ceremonial objects, Christian iconographic traditions all show traces of Persian innovations in using visual symbols to enhance spiritual communication. Persian approaches to sacred geography and pilgrimage practices reflected understanding that physical locations could enhance spiritual experience through their historical associations and geographical characteristics. Zoroastrian concepts of sacred space influenced later developments in pilgrimage practices and holy site veneration throughout religious traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. The Persian understanding of time as a spiritual opportunity created calendar systems and observance practices that continue shaping religious experience today. Persian innovations in coordinating religious observances with astronomical events and seasonal cycles provided templates that appear throughout later religious calendar systems. Persian contributions to funeral practices and death rituals reflected sophisticated understanding of how ceremonial activities could help communities process grief while reinforcing religious teachings about afterlife and cosmic justice. These Persian innovations in death rituals influenced funeral practices throughout cultures that encountered Persian religious ideas. The Persian legacy in marriage customs and family ceremonies reflects religious concepts about cosmic harmony and divine blessing that influenced social practices across diverse cultural contexts. Persian approaches to ceremonial marking of life transitions provided templates that appear throughout cultures showing Persian religious influence. Persian innovations in economic ethics and business practices reflected religious concepts about individual responsibility and cosmic justice that influenced commercial development across vast geographic regions. The Persian understanding of ethical business practices as religious duty appears throughout economic systems that encountered Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to legal theory and judicial practice represents another massive influence that shaped approaches to justice and conflict resolution. Persian legal innovations emphasized individual responsibility, moral consequences, and cosmic justice in ways that profoundly influenced later legal systems throughout cultures that encountered Persian administrative approaches. Persian innovations in diplomatic practice and international relations reflected religious concepts about universal human dignity and divine justice that influenced approaches to cross-cultural interaction and conflict resolution. The Persian emphasis on cultural respect and religious tolerance created diplomatic frameworks that proved more effective than military force for achieving long-term political stability. The Persian influence on military ethics and warfare practices reflects religious concepts about cosmic conflict and ultimate justice that influenced approaches to organized violence throughout cultures that encountered Persian military traditions. Persian innovations in limiting warfare damage to civilian populations and protecting religious minorities appear throughout military traditions, showing Persian influence. Persian contributions to educational philosophy and instructional practice provided frameworks for understanding human learning and intellectual development that continue influencing educational approaches today. The Persian emphasis on individual spiritual development through disciplined study appears throughout educational traditions that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in medical practice and healing approaches reflects religious concepts about cosmic balance and divine intervention that influenced therapeutic traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in understanding psychological factors in physical health appear throughout medical traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in agricultural techniques and land management reflected religious concepts about cosmic harmony and human responsibility that influenced farming practices across diverse geographic regions. The Persian understanding of environmental stewardship as religious duty appears throughout agricultural systems that show Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to technological development and innovation reflects religious concepts about human responsibility for improving earthly conditions that influenced invention and technical advancement across multiple civilizations. Persian approaches to technology that emphasized cosmic harmony appear throughout technical traditions showing Persian influence. Persian innovations in artistic expression and cultural production provided aesthetic frameworks that continue influencing creative work across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of art as spiritual practice appears throughout artistic traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on linguistic development through religious terminology and conceptual frameworks represents another profound contribution that shaped human communication about spiritual and philosophical concepts. Persian religious vocabulary entered dozens of languages and provided conceptual tools that continue shaping intellectual discourse today. Persian contributions to mathematical understanding and astronomical observation reflected religious concepts about cosmic order and divine perfection that influenced scientific development across multiple civilizations. The Persian understanding of mathematical principles as expressions of divine order appears throughout scientific traditions showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in psychological understanding and therapeutic practice reflects religious concepts about individual spiritual development and cosmic responsibility that influenced approaches to mental health and personal growth. Persian innovations in understanding human motivation and behavior change appear throughout psychological traditions that show Persian influence. Persian innovations in social organization and community structure reflected religious concepts about cosmic harmony and individual responsibility that influenced social development across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of social cooperation as spiritual practice appears throughout community organizations showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to conflict resolution and peacemaking practices reflects religious concepts about cosmic justice and ultimate harmony that influenced diplomatic approaches across multiple civilizations. Persian innovations in reconciliation and truth-telling appear throughout peacemaking traditions showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in environmental relationships and ecological practice reflected religious concepts about cosmic balance and human stewardship that influenced approaches to natural resource management. The Persian understanding of nature as divine creation requiring careful protection appears throughout environmental practices, showing Persian influence. The Persian legacy in seasonal observances and cyclical celebrations reflects religious concepts about cosmic renewal and spiritual transformation that influenced festival traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in coordinating ceremonial activities with natural cycles appear throughout celebratory practices, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian contributions to hospitality customs and social interaction reflected religious concepts about universal human dignity and divine blessing that influenced social practices across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of generous hospitality as religious obligation appears throughout social customs, showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on gender relationships and social equality reflects religious concepts about individual spiritual worth and cosmic justice that influenced social development across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in recognizing women's spiritual capabilities appear throughout social systems that encountered Persian religious ideas. Persian innovations in child development and educational practice reflected religious concepts about individual spiritual potential and cosmic responsibility that influenced approaches to youth instruction across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of education as spiritual formation appears throughout child-rearing traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian contribution to aging processes and elder care reflects religious concepts about individual dignity and cosmic wisdom that influenced social approaches to later life stages. Persian innovations in honoring elderly wisdom appear throughout cultural practices that show Persian influence. Persian innovations in disability accommodation and social inclusion reflected religious concepts about universal human worth and divine compassion that influenced social practices across multiple cultures. The Persian understanding of caring for vulnerable populations as religious duty appears throughout social systems, showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in mental health understanding and therapeutic intervention reflects religious concepts about spiritual warfare and cosmic healing that influenced approaches to psychological distress. Persian innovations in understanding mental disturbance as spiritual crisis appear throughout therapeutic traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian contributions to addiction recovery and behavioral change reflect religious concepts about individual choice and cosmic consequences that influenced approaches to destructive behavior patterns. Persian innovations in understanding personal transformation appear throughout recovery traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on criminal justice and rehabilitation practices reflects religious concepts about individual responsibility and cosmic forgiveness that influenced legal approaches to wrongdoing and punishment. Persian innovations in restorative justice appear throughout legal systems that encountered Persian administrative practices. Persian innovations in disaster response and community resilience reflected religious concepts about cosmic testing and divine providence that influenced approaches to natural catastrophes and social crises. The Persian understanding of community solidarity during difficulties appears throughout disaster response traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian contributions to intercultural communication and cross-ethnic cooperation reflect religious concepts about universal human dignity and cosmic unity that influenced approaches to diversity and inclusion. Persian innovations in managing multi-ethnic societies appear throughout political systems that encountered Persian administrative approaches. The Persian legacy in trade relationships and economic cooperation reflects religious concepts about individual honesty and cosmic justice that influenced commercial practices across vast geographic regions. Persian innovations in fair trading practices appear throughout economic systems, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in artistic collaboration and cultural exchange reflected religious concepts about cosmic harmony and divine creativity that influenced approaches to cross-cultural artistic production. The Persian understanding of art as universal language appears throughout collaborative artistic traditions showing Persian influence. Persian contributions to scientific cooperation and intellectual exchange reflect religious concepts about cosmic truth and divine wisdom that influenced approaches to scholarly collaboration across cultural boundaries. Persian innovations in cross-cultural learning appear throughout intellectual traditions that encountered Persian educational approaches. The Persian influence on technological transfer and innovation sharing reflects religious concepts about human responsibility and cosmic progress that influenced approaches to technical development across multiple civilizations. Persian innovations in sharing beneficial technologies appear throughout technical traditions showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in religious cooperation and interfaith dialogue reflected sophisticated understanding of how diverse spiritual traditions could enhance rather than threaten each other through respectful interaction. The Persian approach to religious diversity provided frameworks that continue influencing interfaith relations today. The Persian contribution to philosophical development and intellectual synthesis represents another crucial legacy that shaped approaches to understanding existence and reality across multiple cultural contexts. Persian innovations in combining practical wisdom with theoretical understanding appear throughout philosophical traditions that encountered Persian intellectual approaches. Persian innovations in literary expression and narrative technique reflected religious concepts about cosmic meaning and individual significance that influenced storytelling traditions across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of narrative as spiritual instruction appears throughout literary traditions showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy in musical development and aesthetic expression reflects religious concepts about cosmic harmony and divine beauty that influenced artistic traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in using music for spiritual enhancement appear throughout musical traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. Persian contributions to dance traditions and bodily expression reflect religious concepts about physical participation in cosmic harmony that influenced movement practices across diverse cultural contexts. Persian innovations in using bodily movement for spiritual purposes appear throughout dance traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in architectural design and spatial organization reflected religious concepts about earthly representation of heavenly reality that influenced building practices across multiple civilizations. The Persian understanding of architecture as spiritual communication appears throughout building traditions that encountered Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on urban planning and community design reflects religious concepts about social harmony and cosmic order that influenced approaches to city development across diverse cultural contexts. Persian innovations in creating functional, beautiful communities appear throughout urban planning traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian contributions to transportation systems and communication networks reflect religious concepts about cosmic connection and human cooperation that influenced infrastructure development across vast geographic regions. Persian innovations in facilitating travel and communication appear throughout transportation systems that encountered Persian administrative approaches. The Persian legacy in food preparation and dietary practices reflects religious concepts about cosmic balance and divine blessing that influenced culinary traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in ceremonial food preparation appear throughout dietary traditions, showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in clothing design and personal adornment reflected religious concepts about individual dignity and cosmic beauty that influenced fashion traditions across diverse cultural contexts. The Persian understanding of personal appearance as spiritual expression appears throughout clothing traditions that contributions to recreational encountered Persian cultural influence. Persian activities and entertainment practices reflect religious concepts about cosmic joy and divine celebration that influenced leisure traditions across multiple cultures. Persian innovations in combining entertainment with spiritual instruction appear throughout recreational traditions showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian influence on storytelling techniques and oral tradition preservation reflects religious concepts about cosmic memory and divine wisdom that influenced narrative practices across diverse cultural contexts. Persian innovations in preserving important knowledge through memorable stories appear throughout oral traditions showing Persian cultural influence. Persian innovations in record-keeping and historical documentation reflected religious concepts about cosmic accountability and divine justice that influenced administrative practices across multiple civilizations. The Persian understanding of accurate record-keeping as religious responsibility appears throughout documentary traditions that encountered Persian administrative approaches. Persian contributions to measurement systems and standardization practices reflect religious concepts about cosmic order and divine perfection that influenced technical standards across vast geographic regions. Persian innovations in creating consistent, reliable measurements appear throughout standardization systems showing Persian cultural influence. The Persian legacy represents nothing less than a complete transformation of human understanding about individual significance, cosmic purpose, and ultimate meaning that continues shaping billions of lives today. The religious concepts developed by a single Persian prophet 25 centuries ago conquered the world through their power to address fundamental human concerns about existence, morality, and destiny. This massive cultural achievement happened without military conquest or imperial coercion. Persian religious innovations spread because they provided better frameworks for understanding human experience and cosmic reality than previous approaches to spiritual questions. The Persian contribution to human civilization represents one of the greatest intellectual achievements in history. The Persian Revolution in religious thinking created conceptual tools that transcend any single tradition or community, while continuing to shape human spiritual experience across diverse cultural contexts. Understanding the true historical origins of these concepts reveals the complex processes through which spiritual insight develops and spreads across cultural boundaries. The Persian legacy challenges contemporary assumptions about religious authority and exclusive truth claims while demonstrating the power of ideas to transform human understanding across vast distances of time and space. The concepts that originated in ancient Iran continue providing meaning and guidance for people across diverse religious and cultural backgrounds. This represents a testament to human intellectual creativity and spiritual insight that speaks to universal concerns about individual purpose and cosmic significance. The Persian gift to humanity transcends the boundaries of any single culture, while continuing to influence human spiritual development in ways that most people never recognize or acknowledge. But we're about to discover how this Persian influence created one final shocking transformation that reveals the true scope of their impact on modern religious experience. The story of how Persian concepts shaped contemporary spiritual practice in ways that go far beyond historical influence is about to blow your mind completely. The Persian influence on modern psychological therapy and mental health treatment represents one of the most stunning examples of how ancient religious concepts continue shaping contemporary life in ways that most people never recognize. When you walk into a therapist's office today and discuss concepts like personal responsibility for your choices, the internal struggle between destructive and constructive impulses, or the possibility of fundamental personality transformation through disciplined practice, you're encountering direct descendants of Persian religious psychology developed over 2,000 years ago. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy emphasizes individual responsibility for thoughts and emotions in ways that mirror Zoroastrian teachings about personal choice between good and evil mental patterns. The therapeutic focus on identifying and changing destructive thought processes reflects Persian innovations in understanding how people can transform fundamental aspects of their personality through systematic spiritual work. Contemporary addiction recovery programs use concepts of powerlessness over destructive forces, surrender to higher power, and personal transformation through disciplined practice that trace directly back to Persian religious frameworks about cosmic conflict between good and evil within individual consciousness. The 12-step model that helps millions recover from addiction worldwide represents a secularized version of Persian spiritual psychology. But here's what makes this contemporary influence absolutely mind-blowing. The Persian concepts that now appear in secular therapeutic contexts maintain their psychological effectiveness even when stripped of their original religious framework. The Persian insights about human motivation, behavior change, and personality transformation were so accurate that they continue working in completely different cultural contexts thousands of years after their original development. Modern neuroscience research confirms many Persian insights about consciousness, free will, and behavior modification that seemed purely religious for centuries. Brain imaging studies show that meditation practices derived from Persian religious techniques actually change neural structure in ways that enhance emotional regulation and decision-making capacity. The Persian understanding of spiritual discipline affecting physical brain function proves remarkably accurate according to contemporary scientific investigation. The Persian influence on modern educational philosophy represents another shocking example of how ancient religious concepts continue shaping contemporary institutions. When modern educators emphasize individual potential, personal responsibility for learning, and the transformative power of disciplined study, they're drawing on educational frameworks that originated in Persian religious instruction over 2 millennia ago. Contemporary approaches to character education that emphasize moral reasoning, ethical decision-making, and personal integrity reflect Persian innovations in understanding how moral development actually occurs through systematic instruction and practice. The Persian recognition that intellectual education must include moral formation appears throughout modern educational approaches that aim for complete human development rather than just technical skill acquisition. Persian concepts about learning stages and developmental readiness influence contemporary educational practices that recognize different students need different types of instruction based on their current level of understanding and maturity. The Persian insight that effective teaching must match instructional methods to student developmental needs appears throughout modern pedagogical approaches. The Persian influence on contemporary business ethics and corporate responsibility represents another stunning example of ancient religious concepts shaping modern institutions. When contemporary business leaders discuss stakeholder responsibility, environmental stewardship, and ethical profit-making, they're using conceptual frameworks that trace back to Persian religious teachings about individual responsibility for cosmic harmony. Modern corporate social responsibility initiatives that emphasize long-term thinking, environmental protection, and community benefit reflect Persian innovations in understanding how individual actions affect cosmic balance and ultimate justice. The Persian recognition that short-term gains achieved through harmful methods create long-term negative consequences appears throughout contemporary approaches to sustainable business practice. Persian concepts about honest dealing, fair treatment of workers, and responsible use of resources influence contemporary business practices that go beyond legal requirements to embrace ethical principles. The Persian understanding that individual moral choices in economic activities have cosmic consequences appears throughout modern approaches to ethical business operation. The Persian influence on contemporary environmental movements represents perhaps the most urgent example of how ancient religious concepts continue shaping modern responses to global challenges. When environmental activists discuss human responsibility for protecting natural systems, the interconnectedness of all life, and the moral obligation to preserve the planet for future generations, they're drawing on conceptual frameworks that originated in Persian religious thought. So, there you have it. The biggest religious cover-up in human history laid bare. Every concept of heaven, hell, angels, demons, final judgment, and cosmic battle between good and evil that defines modern spirituality for billions of people originated not from divine revelation but from a Persian fire priest over 25 centuries ago. The evidence isn't debatable anymore. It's documented, systematic, and overwhelming. Next time you're sitting in church, temple, or mosque listening to teachings about the afterlife, remember that you're experiencing the long-term cultural influence of ancient Persian religious imagination that conquered the world through the sheer power of ideas. The truth has been hidden long enough. Now you know where these beliefs really came from.